The scripture reading for this morning's lesson is taken from Romans, the 12th chapter, verses 9 through 12. Romans 12, 9 through 12. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor-giving preference to one another. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good to see you this morning. And go ahead and turn your Bibles to 1 Thessalonians 5. If you're visiting with us, we're glad that you're with us. Let me mention the Midwest Lectureship. It's in October, just kind of plan on October. It's going to be at a Radisson in Northwest Indiana. But it's a Chicago event, and it's Thursday through Saturday morning, Thursday evening through Saturday morning. And I would encourage you to kind of think about if you can be a part of this. The theme is excellent. It's just an excellent theme. It's about our contemporary times and some of the problems we're dealing with, and encourage you to, understanding the times and knowing what to do. It's going to be a good program. When I think of the subject of this morning's sermon, I have different kind of images that go through my mind. For example, I think of the Fiddler on the Roof. How many have seen the Fiddler on the Roof play or the movie, one of the two? It's a great play, great movie. But I think of Tevi. And you remember Tevi, who just kind of always was incessantly talking to God, just kind of looking up to the sky and just talking to God about everything. You know, the price of wheat or the state of the political situation in his world right then, or his cow, or his fantasies of what he would do if he were a rich man. And of course, his struggles with trying to cope with change. He was very much locked to tradition, and he loved tradition, but the world was moving on and changing without him. And he struggled with that, and so he talked to God about it. I also think of Walter Brennan and a role he played on a TV program called The Real McCoys. And those who are my age or older remember The Real McCoys. And he had this habit of just kind of talking to God, sometimes irreverently. He would talk to God as he went about his chores. And he would get very irritated with somebody, and he'd just start talking to God about it. And I think of Walter Brennan. I think of Charles M. Smith in a book that I have that he wrote that's on my shelf. It's a little paperback, but it's entitled "How to Talk to God When You Aren't Feeling Religious." And this little book just kind of asks God about all different kinds of things, not necessarily the kind of things you normally think of when you think of prayer, but they are prayers. As he just says, well, God, what do you think about this situation? What do you think about that situation? And he calls him Sir. And he says, I'm not sure how to talk to you when I'm not in a prayerful mood, but I need to talk to you. And I think of the prophetess that Luke tells us about by the name of Anna. Anna, we're told, was widowed after only 7 years of marriage. And then she spent all of her rest of her days in the temple. Until she was 84 years old, and it says she never left the temple but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. And I think of marriage and the relationship out of which it grew, and the relationship that grows out of marriage. I think of that. I think of many of the conversations and letters I've received from fellow Christians about their own struggle with this whole idea of praying without ceasing. And their attempt to do that, but their frustrations with finding themselves unable to do that. And finally, I think of my own prayer life and many of the sometimes contradictory images that I've had of prayer, and my attempt to live up to those images, and my defeat in trying to do so. What about you? What's your prayer life like? You know, this is like the third or fourth week now we've talked about prayer. What does praying without ceasing mean to you? Does that describe your prayer life? Is this a realm in which you could improve? Well, with all of that on the table, I would like for us to go to our text. It's 1 Thessalonians 5, and we'll start reading at verse 12. And this passage is kind of a very rapid kind of sum up of Paul's doing as he's ending this letter. And he's just kind of almost giving these missiles, these very brief missiles of advice and admonition. He says, "Now we ask you, brothers, to respect those who work hard among you, who are over you in the Lord, who admonish you. Hold them in the highest regard because in love because of their work. Live in peace with each other. We urge you, brothers, warn those who are idle. Encourage the timid. Help the weak. Be patient with everyone. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always try to be kind to each other and to everyone else. Be joyful always. Pray continually. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Do not put out the Spirit's fire. Do not treat prophecies with contempt. Test everything. Hold on to the good. Avoid every kind of evil. May God Himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and He will do it." What does pray without ceasing mean? Have you ever wondered that? You know, there are a variety of different translations of this very short verse. King James, of course, is where we get the term pray without ceasing. Living Bible says, always keep praying, or always keep on praying, 4 words. New International is what I read, of course, pray continually. Revised Standard is also 2 words, but different words, pray constantly. The New Living Translation says, never stop praying. The Good News Translation says, pray at all times. The Message, pray all the time. And finally, the New World Translation says, pray incessantly. Now, in a general sense, all of those seem to be saying the same thing, and yet one can notice technical nuance differences between them. The haunting question for some is prayer to be unbrokenly unending, kind of like a continuum, or is prayer to be faithfully reoccurring? That's the question. You see, one expresses the sentiment of NIV, pray continually, and the other expresses the sentiment of RSV, constantly. Well, fortunately, this is not the only time the apostle talks about this. In fact, in Romans, he wrote to Romans, he says, God whom I serve with my whole heart in preaching the gospel of His Son, my witness is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers all the time, at all times. And then a little bit later in that same letter, he says, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. So the idea of constancy and of faithfulness is a very dominant characteristic. To the Ephesians, he says, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions, and with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep praying for all the saints. And then finally to the Colossians, he said, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. Now, he uses different words. He even uses different images. But the idea is that there are all kinds of occasions for praying, and he says, I want you to be about it. In fact, he says it several times. I want you to pray all different kinds of prayers. I want you to pray all different kinds of times. One of the great theologians of the 20th century was a man by the name of Emil Brunner, and in a little book he has on belief, he says, the moment we really believe we're already praying. And when we cease praying, we also cease believing. That's pretty heavy. He, in another place, writes, he says, prayer, as with all worthwhile deeds, requires time. He who takes no time for the practice will either fail to learn how to pray, or once he knew, will soon forget. Only he who takes much time for prayer then can understand what the apostle means with the words, pray without ceasing. And prayer does not mean saying many words. Hear that? Prayer does not mean saying many words. It means seeking God and letting God seek us. I think what he's trying to say is very true, and that is that we need to be aware that life of fellowship with God cannot be built in a day. To use Bruner's terms, it takes time. And please don't understand this as something burdensome or something heavy. That's not the idea at all. Here I think that images that can be drawn from the lighthearted side of life can be helpful to us. Tevye from the Fiddler on the Roof, or Grandpa Amos, Walter Brennan, just kind of talking constantly to God, kind of in an ongoing conversation with God about everything, about whatever bothers him, just kind of not in a formal kneel on your knees prayer, but just in an ongoing dialogue, lighthearted. Or Charles Merrill Smith's conversations with God, in which he just says, "Sir, what do you think about this?" Well, I understand. You say, well, we need to be more formal in prayer, and certainly there's a place for heavy prayer, even burdensome prayer. The disciples witnessed that in the Garden of Gethsemane before Jesus went to the cross. You remember? It was a heavy time of prayer. As Jesus petitioned his Father to take this cup from him. In fact, we're told that sweat like great drops of blood were falling from him. For a 3-hour period, that intense prayer went on. But there's also time for another kind of prayer. A kind of prayer that nurtures relationship. A light prayer. Maybe even incidental prayer. There's a time for that too. Here I think of marriage. Let me kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about. Trish and I, as a rule, spend at least one evening a week with each other. Just the two of us over dinner. Nothing elaborate, nothing expensive, nothing fancy, just dinner. Sometimes it's at Applebee's or Wendy's or Billina Beef or Garibaldi's. Last evening after I picked her up at the airport, we went to IHOP. And we just exchanged small talk about the day, about our kids, about what's happening, ideas that have passed through our head or passed over our head, about whatever happens to be on our mind at the time. That's all it's about. You see, what we talk about is incidental to the fact that we're talking together. And we're doing it regularly, nurturing our relationship. And then when a pressing issue or crisis does arise, we have a well-nurtured relationship out of which to deal with this crisis. Does that make sense? And so it's not all of a sudden we have this problem, so we have to get reacquainted. Well, such is true with our relationship with God. Prayer at its best is an ongoing conversation. And it can be even routine. But we're nurturing a relationship. Perhaps you're not very comfortable with the whole idea of chit-chatting with God. You've always thought of prayer as being formal, kind of like at church. Well, I understand that. I respect that. But it's also likely that you are not all that much at ease in the beginning with your first conversation with that individual who became your life partner, with whom you now talk about everything. Do you remember how awkward it was on that first occasion? You remember how tough the words came and how hard it was to know what to say next and how to respond? Well, what changed? Well, your relationship changed. What changed it? Well, time spent together changed it. Shared conversations, shared dreams, shared struggles, shared ideas. But probably more than anything else, the relationship was changed with small talk. Because the small talk nurtured the relationship. What you talked about was incidental to the fact that you were talking together and sharing together. Sometimes from the depth of your soul. When I had young children at home, I never, ever complained about having to bus them somewhere, taxi some. I never did that. And the reason was because it gave me time with them. Now, sometimes we would go a long way and neither one of us would speak any word. Sometimes it was just me and my daughter or me and my son, and there was no talk. Sometimes it was me and not only my daughter or son, but friends. And they may be talking, but I wasn't necessarily included in the conversation, but I was there. But there were those occasions in which we were riding together and conversation began, and it was significant. And sometimes it was just kind of out of a sense of spontaneity. Sometimes it was out of a sense of a problem or a struggle. But you see, it was all those times together in being together. That's what made the conversation, when it happened, able to happen in a good way. Well, so is our relationship with God. This is the kind of prayer life that builds and maintains a relationship so that it's all through the regular times of life, the routine of life, so that there is something to draw from when a crisis does occur. I would like to close with alluding to a different thought track completely. But it's related, and that is that life itself can be offered in prayer. Fulton Sheen, in one of his works, says, all work can be turned into prayer, as can all play, recreation, sorrow, and contradiction. Those who work booms and cameras in television studio, stenographers, taxi drivers, doctors, housekeepers, ball players, all can turn their work into prayer, provided they offer it in the name of the good Lord. And then he gives this illustration. He says, down in the gutter of a city street was a drop of water, soiled, dirty, and stagnant. Way up in the heavens, a gentle sunbeam saw it and leaped out of the azure blue sky down to the drop and kissed it, thrilled it through and through with new and strange life and hopes, lifted it up high and higher and higher and higher beyond the clouds, and one day left it as a flake of immaculate snow on a mountain top. So our own humdrum routine workaday lives in the pantry, in the school, in the office, on the farm, in the machine shop, can be ennobled, spiritualized, divinized, provided we bring them the inspiration of someone who knew apostolic zeal and salt, provided we bring them to the inspiration of a captain bearing 5 wounds in the forefront of battle, provided we bring them to a fixed flash of that instant and intolerant enlightenment, the lightning made eternal as the light. In other words, provided we bring our routines in contact with Christ. And if we bring our routines in contact with Christ, then all of a sudden they become something more than just routine. They become royalized. May God bless us as we ponder our own prayer life and what our prayer life could be as opposed to what our prayer life is. May we think outside the box, not just in formal terms, but in very elastic terms that allows us to have conversations with God in our routine times so that when crisis comes, we have a relationship from which to draw and to draw richly. My challenge to you is to pray. And that's going to sound like old before I get through with this series on prayer, but that's what I want you to do. And my specific challenge this morning is I want you to broaden your idea of what prayer is and how you do it and what you pray about. And I want it to be expanded beyond the formal church kind of prayer to the idea of knitting a relationship with God. Sometimes not even with words, but with you're willing to know Him and you're longing to interface with Him. May God bless you in your prayer.